What's up and good evening, everyone. This is Derek here with Rich and Paul. How you guys doing tonight?
Good.
Fantastic.
All right.
Absolutely.
So it's Sunday night again. We're stepping all over Rich's toes, but for good
Right.
purpose because we have part two of a series that we've been excited to bring everybody. So without further ado, I just want to do a quick introduction in case anybody is not familiar with this book or missed our first show. Tonight, the Black Comic Lords are excited to continue our interview series with Ken Quattro, the Eisner Award-winning author of the 2021 book Invisible Men, Black Artist of the Golden Age of Comics. For those not familiar with Invisible Men, it contains the riveting stories of Black artists who drew, mostly covertly behind the scenes, superhero, horror, and romance comics in the early years of the industry. The life stories of each man's personal struggles and triumphs are represented as they broke through into a world formerly occupied only by whites. Using primary source material from World War II era Black newspapers and magazines, this compelling book profiles pioneers like E.C. Stoner, a descendant of one of George Washington's slaves, who became a renowned fine artist of the Harlem Renaissance and the first Black artist to draw comic books. Perhaps more fascinating is Owen Middleton, one of the two we will focus on tonight, who was sentenced to life in Sing Sing. Middleton's imprisonment became a cause célèbre championed by Will Durant, which led to Middleton's release and subsequent comics career. And then there's Matt Baker, whom we covered in our first interview. And he's the most revered of Black artists, whose exquisite art spotlights stunning women and men, and who drew the first groundbreaking Black comic book hero, Fuda. Invisible Men is gorgeously illustrated with rare examples of each artist's work, including full stories from mainstream comic books, from rare titles like All Negro Comics and Negro Heroes, plus unpublished artist photos. Invisible Men features Ken Quattro's impeccable research and lean writing, detailing the social and cultural environments that formed these extraordinary yet invisible men. So it truly goes without saying that this Eisner Award-winning book, Invisible Men, is required reading for the Black comic lord community. And here's the book right here, in case you have any questions. So tonight,
Uh-huh.
it is our pleasure to have back on our show the historian and writer of Invisible Men, Mr. Ken Quattro.
Hi, everybody. Happy to be back.
Hey, it's great to have you back, Ken. Awesome. So we had a great interview the last time. I just want to take a minute just to talk about that last interview. So we talked about Matt Baker, and we really appreciated the opportunity to have you share your research and just some fine points on Matt Baker's life, and then to open up a broader discussion. We were also really happy to have strong participation from the chat. So I'm really hoping and excited to have the chat full and ready for some good participation tonight too. So we'll be on the lookout for your questions.
Can I just jump in real quick and give you a quick update about Matt Baker? Um,
Absolutely, and yes, please.
since this last broadcast, I've been contacted by another person interested in Black comics history. That apparently him and some other people are making a presentation to the city of Pittsburgh, and they're trying to get a street named after Matt Baker in the Homewood section of Pittsburgh where he grew up. And I'm supposed to learn more about it this week. And actually, they're using my book as one of the part of the presentation that they're making to the city of Pittsburgh. So that would be a great, I think, it'd be a wonderful thing that finally, he'd be getting some recognition in his hometown.
That's
Oh,
what's up.
that's awesome, and congratulations just on that recognition that they want to use your book too. So
Well, it's all due to him, and that's all I want.
yeah, yeah, and I'll just say, your book Invisible Men is very apropos, and I just want to thank you for helping to make them more visible. Um, that said, I will say that one of the two people we'll talk about tonight, um, he was very visible, but part of him was very invisible. So
Yes.
without further ado, we will introduce our topic. So we're going to talk about Owen Middleton, who is an artist and activist, and he
Right.
was actually born in 1888 and passed in 1954. And then Adolphe Barreaux, who was a writer, artist, and studio owner. And you can see 1899 through 1985. If I were to say anything about these two, they're very different people, and I'm not going to steal too much thunder from Ken. But to me, when I read about both these in your book, what struck me was they're almost mirror opposites of each other in terms of how they reacted to their environment. Middleton seemed to be a very selfless person, while Barreaux was just the opposite, extremely self-serving. But both of them had some great accomplishments that have had some large impacts. So we'll talk about those tonight.
Yep, great. If I could start off, I'd like to start with Owen Middleton, Owen Charles Middleton. As you say, he was born in 1888 in Charleston, South Carolina. And as you can probably guess from his age, his parents were slaves. His father was actually of the Gully group down there in South Carolina, which is unique to that area. You might know them as Geechees, which they have a totally unique Afrocentric culture, which is unique to that. It's to just some few islands right off of Charleston. Anyway, it's it's interesting that he came from that particular group of blacks and that, which had a different background than the normal slaves of the area. But even so, Charleston at the time was it was one of the biggest cities in the United States at the time in the 1800s, and mostly due to the slave trade. And it also had one of the largest freedmen group of blacks. Almost 8% of the population was actually freed blacks at the time leading up to the Civil War. And Middleton came from the other side of the tracks, though. His family was not wealthy. And there's not too much known about his parents at the time down there, but after a couple of devastating hurricanes in the 1890s, his family moved up to Cleveland, which you would assume was a much more inviting atmosphere for blacks, being in the North. And his father had a job as a plasterer, which was a fairly skilled occupation, but even so, they still weren't wealthy or anything. Middleton himself was obviously a very talented artist at a young age. He went to Case Western for a couple of years, which is a college up in Cleveland. And from there, he went to the Art Institute of Chicago, which is sort of an elite art school and very unique for a black person at that time, which would have been the early 1900s. And he actually spent a summer over in France studying fine art, which again was highly unusual, for any artist, but especially for a black artist of the time. However, at the same time he was doing well academically, personally, he was having issues. He got into a fight when he was a young man with a group of white kids. And even though he was one who was beat up, he was sent to reform school for 3 years, and they were all let go. And that sort of started a whole series of minor run-ins he had with the law, which led up to finally he was arrested for passing a bad check at one point. He changed a check from $1.75 to $91.75, and he ended up going to prison. A couple years after that, he was sent to prison again, and this time he was sent to prison for being a conscientious objector. This is 1916, and it was a lead up to the United States entering World War I. And he was a conscientious objector at a time when the United States didn't recognize that designation. And instead of allowing him to either take a different position, as they do most times, where they allow someone to become a medic and serve in a nonviolent capacity, he was sent to Leavenworth Prison as a federal prisoner. And he spent 3 years in Leavenworth. And his cellmate at the time, though, was a guy named Big Bill Haywood, who was very instrumental and very important in union organizations in the United States in the early 1900s. And he headed up a group called the International Workers of the World, the IWW, or the Wobblies is what they were known as. And it was basically a left-wing organization in that. And that sort of radicalized, knowing Haywood and his interest in unionization, radicalized Middleton. And when he left Leavenworth in 1919, he immediately began working in different activist areas in that, and specifically in union organization. During that same time period, in the early 1920s, Middleton took different jobs. He bounced around from different jobs. He had an artist job in a hospital as a surgical artist. He had a job in a Grand Rapids, Michigan furniture factory as a designer. And he actually had a job as a seaman and traveled around the world. But that ended when he was at a seaport in Turkey, and he came across some British sailors who didn't take kindly to seeing a black man, and they beat him severely and everything. And that sort of ended his interest in traveling around the world, and he came back to the United States very bitter about not just the way he's being treated in the United States, but the racism that he experienced in different places around the world. Well, in 1926, during this time period, Middleton got married, but in 1926, he ended up getting arrested once again, and this time was for armed robbery. And he happened to get arrested in New York State. Well, New York had just passed a law that said if you have 3 felonies, you automatically were sent to prison for life, and there was no appealing it or anything. So 1926, he was sent to Sing Sing prison, and he was given a life sentence. So for the next couple of years, he was in prison, and the prison surgeon became aware of his artistic talents, and he allowed Middleton to work as his assistant in doing illustrations of his surgeries so he could keep a record of them as he went along. Well, the surgeon left, and he wrote a letter trying to get Middleton let out of prison, but they just ignored it. And then around 1928, Middleton made a mistake. He decided, he did a drawing, and he tried to get it out of the prison, and he gave it to one of the guards. Well, the guard got caught trying to smuggle this drawing out of the prison, and the guard was fired. But since they considered the drawing contraband, Middleton was put in solitary confinement. So from 1928 to 1930, he was in solitary confinement. But while he was in there, there was a man named Will Durant, who was a world famous philosopher. And he decided to write a book. And the book was called On the Meaning of Life. And what he did is he contacted famous people from all around the world. He contacted writers like Sinclair Lewis and Will Rogers, who was a well-known comedian, and Mohandas Gandhi from India. And I don't know how he found out about Middleton, but they decided to contact a prisoner to see what his outlook was on life. And he expected, Durant didn't expect to get anything back in return, or if he did, he'd probably find a very bitter man. But what he did find was he got this beautiful letter from Middleton, a very thoughtful and deeply philosophical letter from Middleton, and it became the highlight of the book. And as a matter of fact, the letter that he wrote, he just signed it with his convict number, and the letter became published all over the world. And Middleton's philosophical outlook on life came through there and impressed so many people that people from all over the world started writing letters asking for his release from prison. And it took 5 years, but finally in 1935, he was paroled based upon becoming this cause célèbre. And immediately he became involved in civil rights activism, which was just really getting started in the 1930s. And he worked mostly for black newspapers as a writer, and he did a lot of political cartooning. And one of his most famous cases that he worked on was the Scottsboro Boys case. And Derek, can you pull that up at all those drawings? I'm sorry. Yeah, those right there. He did a whole series of these cartoons. And what the Scottsboro Boys were was a group of young black men who were riding the rails. They were riding a railroad train in through Scottsboro. I'm not sure what state it was down south, but they were accused of raping 2 white women. Well, as far as the Southern blacks were concerned at that time, that was a capital offense. And anyways, there was a whole series of trials of these young men, and a couple of them, they were convicted and sentenced to death. And it took years before they were finally acquitted and let go, because the women eventually admitted that they lied about the entire incident. But one of the things that brought attention to it was Middleton's cartoons. Even though he was well known in the black community as an artist in that, he found a tough time finding jobs, particularly during the Depression. And in the 1940s, just like a lot of poor artists at the time, he found the way to make any money off of his talents at all was in comic books. And like I've mentioned before, comic books were an entryway for not just poor blacks, but poor whites or women or anybody else who was marginalized. Was a way for these artists to make money. And when many of the white artists were sent away during World War II, the black artists remained at home, and they would find jobs through what was called comic shops, which are basically studios. And as I explained in the Matt Baker interview, these comic shops provided a buffer between the white publishers and the black artists, because what these black artists would do is they would work through the studio, and the studio owner would hire anybody. He didn't care what color they were, what sex they were, anything. He would hire these black artists to do these drawings, and then he in turn would turn it into the white publisher who would publish them. And then he would pay the studio owner, and he in turn would pay the black artist. And Middleton got a job with the studio of Harry Chesler. And there's 2 examples of his artwork right there. Middleton basically worked most of the time as an inker. And I think most comic fans are aware that comic books, there's generally one person who does the penciling and another person who does the inking, the finished artwork. And he was the inker mostly of an artist named Charles Sultan, and he was the studio head. Even though he worked for Harry Chesler, Charles Sultan was the art director. And Middleton was the inker on many of Sultan's pieces of artwork. But there is one story that he did sign, and it's that one that's on the right there. And it was just a short 4-page real-life story about an a pilot who was shot down in the South Pacific in World War II. And it appeared in a comic book called War Heroes. And ironically enough, the rest of the comic book, including the cover, was drawn by Elmer Stoner, who was a black artist who made it his mission to get as many black artists as he could into the comic book industry. And I'm guessing that he was the man who got Middleton the job working in comic books. At the same time, while he was working in the comic book industry and that, Middleton gave an interview to a newspaper called The People's Voice. And it was a newspaper that was published by Adam Clayton Powell. And you guys are too young, probably remember Adam Clayton Powell, but he was a very important civil rights leader in New York. He was in Harlem, New York, and that he was a congressman for years and years. But prior to that, he was a newspaper publisher. And he interviewed, or he had somebody named Augustus Strong interview Middleton. Yeah, right there. And Middleton spoke about his lifelong interest in working as an artist and as a cartoonist. He talks quite a bit in there about working in the comic book industry, but even though he himself didn't read comic books, he appreciated the opportunities that came from it because it allowed him to pay the bills just like all these other comic book artists were able to do. It wasn't high-end work, but he mentions in the article like $15 to $50 per page, which was pretty good money back in the 1940s for anybody. And but just like every other black artist, that ended when World War II ended. When the white artists came back and they regained their jobs that they lost when they went away in the service. And with that, Middleton went back to working basically in the black media. And he became a political cartoonist, and he became more involved in political activism. He worked, if you look on the right there, he worked for the Henry Wallace presidential campaign. Henry Wallace was a socialist who was actually a former vice president of the United States, but he ran on for what was called the Progressive Party, which was a leftist socialist party. And the person in charge of publicity for Henry Wallace's national campaign was Owen Middleton. And he did this particular cartoon that ran in newspapers all over the country, as a campaign ad for Wallace. Throughout the 1940s and the rest of the 1940s, Middleton's profile rose quite a bit. He was involved with the United Nations in some different organizations. He was very much involved with his community. He lived in Bedford-Stuyvesant in New York, and he was involved on a local level there very much. He worked for the American Labor Party, which was a left-wing socialist party. And in 1954, he actually ran for the State Assembly of New York as the candidate in his district. And 2 weeks before the election, though, in 1954, he dropped dead. And, despite this, he wasn't pulled off the ballot or anything. Instead, the American Labor Party ran ads in the black newspapers, first of all, as a tribute to Middleton, but also asking people in his district to vote for him nonetheless, to show their respect and how much reverence they had for Middleton as a man for his years of activism, which at that time it extended back 40 years. And even though he was dead, he received almost 1,000 votes. And, he was an amazing human being and so resilient and so impressive for what he went through, and he overcame, and he was the epitome of a person who overachieved, no matter what obstacles were put before him. He's just an amazing man.
Mr. Ken,
yes, sir.
You've already answered several of my questions. So, I do have a few questions though. In regards to Middleton's effort as an activist, in regards to trying to get the federal anti-lynching bill passed,
Exactly.
at that time, it was pretty remarkable. And given that it's taken several decades to pass such a bill, can you talk about what those times were like for Middleton and for Black people around that time? Because I think that a lot of people, particularly today, do not realize how horrific it was for even the thought of bringing up or petitioning Congress to pass an anti-lynching bill. So can you speak to that for a brief moment?
Yeah, you see, Rich, that's one of the things, personally, I would talk from my personal point of view here, because that's something that didn't come across until I actually read these Black newspapers. I read hundreds, if not thousands, of Black newspapers in putting together this book. And the thing that struck me, probably the most shattering thing of all, was how lynching was so common in the United States, say from about 1950 going back. Literally almost on a daily basis, you would read about another lynching of a Black person in the South. And it was common, it was shockingly common. It was happening, like I say, almost on a daily basis. Whereas in white newspapers, you would never even see it mentioned, or if it was, if some were stuck way in the back pages. So when Middleton was fighting for a passage of an anti-lynching law in the late 1930s, it was unheard of. First of all, for most most white people weren't even aware of the extent of the lynching if they weren't in the southern states to begin with. A person from like my area up here in Michigan, they probably weren't even aware of how prevalent it was. And yet, you know, this was part of everyday life for Blacks. And for Middleton to have the nerve to speak out publicly, and he did so at big rallies like in New York and Washington, D.C. in the 1930s, is mind-boggling. This was a time period where, you know, Marian Anderson, who was one of the greatest singers that the United States has ever had, was banned in 1940 from appearing at a hall owned by the Daughters of the American Revolution in Washington, D.C. in 1940. And at the same time, here's Owen Middleton, a former prisoner, a man who's been in prison probably off and on almost over 20 years of his life. And he was standing up and, you know, publicly talking before people about these horrific things that Blacks are being subjected to around the country. And to me, it's one of the most inspirational stories. It is the most inspirational story of anybody in this book, and one of the most inspirational stories I've read of anybody. And he's become one of my personal heroes, just because of, you know, his sheer will and his sheer perseverance over such a long period of time. And he was undaunted. Like I said, you know, he was in prison for over 20 years, and he kept fighting right up until literally the end of his life.
Wow. So given that this guy has had this extraordinary life, right? When I first read this chapter about him, I was amazed.
Mm-hmm.
And so I said to myself, this should be in a movie. This should be a movie. This guy should have his own.
Oh, sure.
And so I'm just curious, just a nerd geeky thing. If there was a movie about Owen Middleton, who could play Owen Middleton in your opinion?
Well, I've thought about, it's funny you say that, because I've thought about that a lot. And I've talked to several people who, you know, they've talked about doing either movie or movies, you know, based on people in the book. And Middleton is the one I always suggest. And, you know, I said, you know, I played the same game. I said, who would I cast as Owen Middleton? And if he was younger, I'd say Samuel L. Jackson, because he has the presence, to pull it off. But he's too old to do it now. But if I had to pick one actor who's around today, I kind of figure Jeffrey Wright.
Yes, sir.
He plays Commissioner Gordon in the Batman. He's been in Westworld. He's been in a million different shows. Boardwalk Empire, if you're familiar with that. And I just think he has the presence and in the sense of gravitas in his voice and everything. I think he could pull it off. He brings the sense of dignity that I think that somebody needs to play Middleton. And I think he'd be good.
Gotcha. Paul, you up? What you got, bro?
Yeah, Mr. Quattro, Ken, one of the things you mentioned was this article done by the People's Voice.
Correct.
April 15th of 1944. The comic artist is a seasoned unionist. In that article, there are several pictures. Derek will put, yeah, there it is. Now, if you look in that lower right-hand corner,
I know what you're going to say.
There's a picture of a comic called Bullet Man, and I think Derek has a color version of this.
Yeah.
Right. Now, this is assumably work of Middleton's, and right next to it, we have a picture of Supernatural Thrillers #5, which is a very popular book in our community.
Yeah.
It's the first appearance of Nkanu, the living mummy. This was released in 1973, and the artist was Rick Buckler. Is it possible, any chance, do you have any knowledge as to whether or not Rick Buckler—
I don't, but it's so funny you mentioned that, because I've noticed, the cover too, because I have that comic, the Living Mummy too. Actually, Middleton wasn't the pencil artist on the Bullet Man, so he was the inker of that. It's actually Charles Sultan who's the artist, the pencil artist. So he inked that. But just looking at the drawings, to me, there's almost no doubt that Buckler had to see it. It appeared in a Bullet Man comic book, which is a fairly well-known Fawcett comic book. And Rich Buckler was a Golden Age comic fan. I know that for a fact. As a matter of fact, he used to run the comic book conventions here in Detroit when I was a kid. And, I know for certain that he was a big Golden Age fan. But I know that's amazing, the similarity, and it's too much of a coincidence to not be real. He had it.
It has to be. It has to be.
Yeah,
I just want to get your input on that.
Yeah.
Another thing that you had mentioned, it's actually in your book, was the 2 Months in a Bush story,
right?
On the life of Corporal J. Hartman. Was that based on a true story?
Yeah. The whole comic book series is called War Heroes.
Yeah.
And for the first half dozen or so issues, actually more than that, I think, it was mostly drawn by Elmer Stoner. Ironically enough, he drew the covers, and in this particular comic, he drew 5 of the stories as well as the cover, and the other story is drawn by Middleton. So almost the entire comic is a black comic book. If anybody wants to look it up, I have a copy somewhere on that. You can pick it up fairly cheap, and probably everybody's going to buy it on eBay before, But it's called War Heroes #5, I believe it is.
Yeah.
But it has a Elmer Stoner cover in about 5 stories, and the one signed story by Middleton. So
you mentioned that this was a series of comics regarding war heroes.
Right.
Given Middleton's anti-war stance that led to him being imprisoned as a result, is it not ironic that he would do something that would, for all intents and purposes, be viewed as a propaganda piece? Well,
if you look at all the Spy Smasher and all those other things that he did for Fawcett, they were all war-related comics too. And what I think it is, Paul, is just like a lot of the black artists who ended up drawing like Sheena or these White Jungle Lord comics and stuff like that. I think that they just distance themselves from what they're actually drawing. And, like it says in that article, Middleton claims that he never even read the comic books that he drew, which I believe. I mean, he probably just looked at it as a job. He could have been drawing, dogs, or he could have been drawing coffee cups or whatever else. To him, it probably didn't equate to being a statement of any kind. You know, there were certain comics that came out later on, like the Challenger and all Negro comics and stuff like that, that, you know, made political statements, or they were commentary on civil rights and that. But the average comic book was looked at as a throwaway item meant totally for kids.
Right.
And it wasn't like anybody, most of the people who worked on them didn't consider comic books as anything else. They didn't take them seriously, even the artists drawing them. You know, even from our perspective, you know, we take comic books very seriously. You know, me, you guys, and, you know, the people listening to this, you know, we take comic books far more seriously than the people did of the 1940s. You know, I can guarantee that. And I know that even from the artists I spoke to. I've interviewed many of these Golden Age artists, and they all said the same thing. They said, Ken, it was a way of, you know, feeding my family. You know, I had, you know, this is what I could do. I could draw, and this is my skill, and I was able to cash in on it. You know, you had a few guys like Will Eisner and Jack Kirby who took it really serious. But for the majority of them, it was nothing. It was just a way of making some money, and they couldn't care less about what they were drawing.
Right.
All right. So, you know, that's the very great story of Owen Middleton. Once again, 1888 to 1954. You know, guys, you saw a little bit about some of his works. Maybe you can, if you look really hard, you can find some of those out there. But make sure, hey, get the book, get Invisible Men, read about Owen Middleton. We're gonna move to our next artist now. He was more than just an artist, by the way. Adolphe Barreaux. He was a writer, an artist, and a studio owner. So, Ken, why don't you just tell us about Adolphe?
Okay. Well, in a lot of ways, you know, Adolphe Barreaux and Owen Middleton have certain things in common, but they couldn't be more different. Just like Middleton, Barreaux was born in Charleston, South Carolina, in about 10 years after Middleton. But his upbringing was different. Middleton's family, his mother specifically, was raised by a family called Gadsden. And this family was, they were freedmen, which means that they had a long line of, they had a long history, personal history of not having been in slavery, even prior to the Civil War. Well, she was raised by this family, but she was adopted, which was very unusual for a black family to adopt anybody. And I started looking into Barreaux because there'd long been rumors that he was black, but nobody had ever really proven that he was. So I started looking into his history and going in deeply into his family's history. And anyways, it turns out that his mother, whose name was Charlotte, was raised by this family named Gadsden, and her name was Georgiana, and she was raised by this family, and she was a seamstress. Well, her last name was Little. Her name was Georgiana Little. And what was interesting about that is that there was no black family. I literally looked at the voting records from the 1870s, and there was no black family in Charleston, South Carolina, with the last name of Little. However, there were a bunch of whites families named Little, and one of them was a guy named George Little, and he happened to own a dress shop not that far away from where Georgiana Little grew up. And so what I surmised is that he was the father, and this woman named Charlotte Gadsden was the mother, and she ended up raising her daughter that she had with George Little. And that was very common for that time period. For these mixed race children, which were called at the time mulattoes, and which is an old time term going back to colonial times. And it has a very ambiguous meaning because according to the definition, it was anybody who had even a drop of black blood was considered a mulatto, meaning that they weren't pure white. So they know through statistics, 75% of the blacks who came out of Charleston, South Carolina, were considered mulattoes, meaning that they had white blood. Anyways, I'll jump forward. Barreaux was born in 1899, in January 1899. And just a few months after he was born, his father died of typhoid. His father's name was also Adolphe Barreaux. And he died of typhoid. His name was Adolphe Barreaux Gripon, and he died of typhoid. And so his mother, Georgiana, was left a widow, and she had a daughter too. And after a couple of years, she could no longer afford to raise both kids. So she turned them over to her sister-in-law, who was Gripon's sister. And she raised kids by herself for a few years until the young Adolphe Gripon developed typhoid too. And at that time, the only known cure was a change of climate. South Carolina has a very hot, humid climate, and that just exacerbates typhoid fever. So this aunt, her name was Eugenia Gripon, took the two kids, Adolphe and his sister, and moved up to New York City. But when she moved there, she didn't just change the location. She changed the name. She dropped the Gripon name and just used the last name of Barreaux. And she stopped listing herself as black or mulatto. And she started saying that they were all white. And they were able to, what they call at that time, pass for white, which was fairly common in that time period. And here's, I don't know if you can see it too clearly here, but just as proof of what went on in 1900 census, you can see where young Adolphus Gripon is listed as black on the federal census. Well, a few years later, by the 1930 census, he's got a different last name, and now he's white. And he very clearly lists himself as white. And the reason why they did that, because obviously, there were certain privileges that came with being white that they never would have as being black. And Adolphe took full advantage of that. He ended up going to DeWitt Clinton High School, which is the same high school that later on Will Eisner, Bob Kane, Stan Lee all went to. And after he graduated from DeWitt Clinton, he was accepted at Yale. And while Yale didn't have a policy against blacks going there, when he went there circa 1916, there were no blacks going there at the time. So the only way he got into Yale was by declaring himself to be white. And he did exceptionally well at Yale. He's a brilliant student, and he was an excellent artist. And upon graduation, he went in a couple different areas. He was doing some pulp writing on the side. He worked for, here's two of the magazines he worked for, Breezy Stories and this mystery magazine. This is in the early 1920s. And, he wrote stories for both of them. He also opened up an art studio with a partner. And, they worked on certain commercial art projects together. And then later on in the 20s, he became a well-known illustrator, commercial artist, and just basically a well-known personality around New York. And of all the men who are featured in my book, he's the only one where most of the information that I found on him came from white media as opposed to black media. And that's because Barreaux was constantly in the newspaper columns. He was always in a newspaper column where he would be making jokes. He was known as a real bon vivant around town. He was a real ladies' man. He dated showgirls and models, and they were always writing articles about all these women he was with all the time. And he wrote he took a tour around the United States looking for the ideal model, and this was a column that was carried in newspapers all over the country. And like I said, he was a well-known personality. Commercial artists and illustrators at that time were treated like celebrities, almost like actors are now. And he was right up there amongst them. He was right up there with the well-known white illustrators because nobody knew he was black. And around 1929 or so, he hooked up with a fledgling publisher. It was a guy who was a printer who was just getting into publishing magazines, a guy named Harry Donenfeld. Well, Harry Donenfeld was involved in mostly what at that time was considered pornography. He published pulp magazines, but they were girly pulp magazines. And Barreaux started doing some drawings for him. And then later on, about 1933, Harry Donenfeld bought this old venerable newspaper tabloid called the Police Gazette. It was a pink-colored newspaper. And the artist on the Police Gazette was Adolphe Barreaux. He used the name Ad Barreaux, as you can see there. But he became like Donenfeld's go-to guy. He was exclusively started working for Donenfeld. And beyond the Police Gazette, he worked for Donenfeld's different pulps. He worked for what was called the spicy pulps. And these pulps, it mostly featured like showgirls who were basically either totally nude or partially nude and stuff. And he drew a comic strip that appeared in a lot of these spicy pulps. And it was called Sally the Sleuth. And Sally the Sleuth was just what it sounds like. She was a female private detective, but somehow in every single story, she ends up out of her clothes. It only ran for a couple pages, but somehow during the story, her clothes would come off. Well, that was Barreaux's claim to fame, circa the early to late 1930s. But in the mid 1930s, specifically in January 1935, a guy named Major Malcolm Wheeler Nicholson got an idea to publish a comic book that wasn't based upon reprints. Up to that time, most comic books in the United States, actually all comic books in the United States, were reprinted material from newspaper comic strips. Well, what Wheeler Nicholson came up with was the idea of printing original material in a newspaper, in a comic book form, and selling it. And the advantage of that was he didn't have to pay the licensing to buy expensive newspaper comic strips. He could go out and hire poorly paid artists to draw original strips for him. And Barreaux ended up working in what is the very first American comic book in the format that we know it as, called New Fun. And the very first one, though, but to carry original material, his contribution was called Magic Crystal of History. And so Barreaux, unbeknownst to anybody, became the first black artist to work in comic books, and he worked in the first American comic book to publish original material, which is highly historic in itself, but it's something nobody would have known because he never told anybody that he was black. Well, at the same time he was doing this, he also set up a studio which was funded by Donenfeld called the Majestic Studio. And what this became was the first comic studio or comic shop to produce comic books. And just like I mentioned previously, these comic shops were studios that publishers would go to produce a comic book for them. Most publishers at that time didn't have their own staffs. They didn't have artists. They didn't have writers. They were just publishers. And they would contract these studios or comic shops to produce a comic book for them. Well, the very first studio to form was the Majestic Studio, and that was headed up by Adolphe Barreaux. And, at that time, they were doing work, for not only New Fund, but they were also doing work on several other comics at the time. If you flip to the next one, I think, yeah, right there, it gives you an example. He also did, on his own, Barreaux did some work outside of the studio. The one on the left is Champion Comics, which was published by a different publisher, which ended up becoming MLJ, which ended up becoming Archie Comics later on. But early on was this, he did work for this comic book. He did several episodes of this Dragon's Teeth story. And then on the right, there's Patio Day, which he did for the Eisner and Iger studio. And that appeared in early issues of Wonder World Comics, circa 1940 or so. But for all intents and purposes, most of the work that he did was for Harry Donenfeld, and mostly in his pulp magazines. He continued doing, this is majority of his work throughout the 1940s was working for Donenfeld. And he probably did it right up into going into the early 1950s. And at that time, his comic books were starting to fall off. He left comic books, and he became, he worked for Fawcett Publications as an editor. And it was on different publications, but mostly for publications that have to do with photography. And he did that for a number of years, from the mid-1950s up into the 1970s. But during that time, he also started writing letters to his hometown newspaper in Charleston, South Carolina. And there's a great irony in this part of the story, because Barreaux had told everybody that he was actually from New Jersey. He was a white guy from New Jersey, and that's what he told everyone. But he apparently forgot all that by the 1970s, because by the 1970s, he was writing to the Charleston newspaper, talking about how much he enjoyed his youth in Charleston, and talking about, how much he loved the city and the people of the South. But he also revealed in these letters that he was an arch conservative, and he would talk about his friends Strom Thurmond and Mendel Rivers, who were two of the biggest segregationists of the mid 20th century. Strom Thurmond is the man who tried stopping the Voting Rights Act in 1964. But this is one of Barreaux's closest friends. Barreaux wrote in one of the letters, he talks about he stayed in a hotel and he got to sleep in Robert E. Lee's bed and how much he enjoyed it. And visiting the Confederacy Museum and how much he enjoyed, seeing that Confederacy Museum, and he's being inspired by it. And he basically became a huge racist. And it's one of the oddest things I've ever experienced in recent researching somebody's life, is where it had this sense of, I don't know if it was self-loathing or if he bought so much into this identity that he'd created for himself that he not only obscured his black heritage, but he openly loathed it. He hated it. And his family apparently either don't know or they totally reject any suggestion that they have any black in them. His son, who I've been told I can't really talk about, is became a big official in the Republican Party. He ended up being one of Richard Nixon's closest advisors, and he worked on campaigns for the Republican Party for years and years. And it's one of the oddest things, like I said, where Barreaux had this, like I said, I don't know if it's a sense of self-loathing or if he just felt that he had to buy into his false identity that much. It meant that much to him to obscure it. But it's one of the strangest things ever. He not only, passed for white, he openly rejected it, which is unusual even for people who passed as white because, matter of fact, just recently I read an article, I believe it was in Forbes magazine, which talked about blacks in the past who passed for white, and most of them would pass for white out in public at work, but they would return to their black identity at home and amongst their friends and family. He did neither. He just passed as white and just rejected everything to do with his blackness.
And Ken, in your in the book, you also talk about some of the other, I guess, roles that were all around that whole situation of blacks passing for white. I mean, you had, I think you mentioned you had some owners of companies that would employ black people.
Well,
yeah.
Right. Well, I mean, he certainly wasn't the only one ever to do it. Another prime example is George Harriman, the guy who did Crazy Cat. George Harriman was a black Creole from New Orleans, but he passed as white his entire life. Yet it wasn't until, there was always suspicion about him because he had tight black curly hair and everything. But he would pass it off as just he had, tight black hair. But he wasn't the only one. There was, it was a common thing, for a lot of blacks in that time period. And if you read any black media during that period, it was always it was an ongoing debate about, whether it was a good thing or bad thing to do. It was, obviously it was there was a lot of advantages to, passing as white if you could, but it's also kind of a cheat in a way. And like I say, a lot of the black, especially a lot of the black writers and philosophers would argue back and forth about that, like Marcus Garvey and W.E.B. Du Bois wrote about it.
Okay. And I just wanted to check with you. So you've talked about some of the firsts that Adolphe Barreaux, that are attributed to him. You mentioned New Fun Comics, and then also in the book you mentioned that I think it was you in your book that mentioned he's the first published American comic. He has the first published American comic work. Sorry, he was the first black artist to be published in an American comic book, at least credited, I'm guessing.
Right.
And then first art studio, which I'll go and ask the question now. We talked about Matt Baker last week, and Matt Baker was able to do what he did because he worked for an art studio.
Right.
The fact that Adolphe Barreaux actually started the first art studio, maybe even instrumental in creating that model overall. Do you believe that was instrumental in Matt Baker getting to where he got to?
Oh, every single one of the black artists of that time period, they all worked for a comic studio. And even though it wasn't Barreaux's intention, when he created the studio, the concept of a comic art studio or comic shop, he inadvertently ended up benefiting the black artists who came along later, because it provided them with the buffer that they needed to get the job. Because, like for instance, Alvin Hollingsworth wrote about it later. He says, I couldn't just walk into a publisher's office and get a job on my own because they wouldn't hire me. He says, but by going to one of these comic shops, the guys who ran the comic shops didn't care who worked for them, and they would hire black artists. And so the black artists could do the work either at home or in the studio, and then the white shop owner would sell it to the publisher. And so Barreaux ended up inadvertently providing the pathway for black artists to get into comic books, even though that was never his intention to do so. He did it out of benefiting himself.
And women artists too, right?
Exactly. Right. Yeah, same thing. I mean, it was, well, women artists were more easily accepted in studios, but they also suffered a lot of the same abuse that women always would go to in offices or anything. There's a lot of stories of the things that guys would say to him. Bob Powell was known for saying very misogynistic and terrible things to women that he worked with, and making a lot of innuendo, dirty jokes and stuff like that, and guys making passes at him. So they were accepted more within the working in the studios than say blacks were. A lot of the black artists, even though they worked for a studio, they wouldn't physically work in the studio. They would take their assignment and go home and draw it, then bring it back and drop it off.
Was that due to some type of due to the segregation at the time?
Well, it was just an awkward situation, and the one who told me about that was Al Feldstein. I interviewed Al Feldstein about 20 years ago about that very thing. He worked with Matt Baker. He sat next to Matt Baker, and Matt Baker was one of only a few. Him and Alvin Hollingsworth were the only black artists that I know of who physically worked in a studio with the white artists. The rest of the black artists would go home, just take their assignment and go home and work on it. So a lot of the white artists never even met their black co-workers. They didn't even know they were working with black artists. Like, for instance, Owen Middleton working for Charles Sultan, there's a real good chance that Charles Sultan never even saw Owen Middleton. He would do the pencils, he would hand it off, and they would give the pencil artwork to Middleton, who would probably ink it at his home and drop it back off at the studio. It was just such a weird situation. And when I asked Feldstein about it, he was embarrassed. He literally was. He says, I'm embarrassed to say it. He says, but that's just the way it was at the time. He says, we didn't associate with him. He says, Baker was a nice guy and everybody admired him. But he says when they'd all go out for a drink or lunch and that, he would never go. He was never invited and he never went. He always kept to himself. And that was just, it was just that line that, was never crossed at that time. That's what, again, part of the reason why the book's called Invisible Men. They were literally invisible to even their co-workers.
And I guess the business person in me has me wondering, I'm guessing part of the reason why they would employ black artists in the first place is probably because they could pay them less.
Well, like I said, that's something, I can't prove, but I wouldn't doubt it one bit, because there was no set pay scale a lot of times. And it was basically up to the studio owner how much he would pay him. But you're probably right. He probably did. I mean, he probably, blacks and women were getting paid less than whites in every other field. So why not in comics? It just, fits with the times. It's hard for us from our point of view, even though we understand that time period, how segregation was and how separate everything was. I think it's still hard for us to imagine how pervasive it was throughout American society. Because what's ironic is a lot of the white artists came from immigrant and underprivileged backgrounds themselves. They were, immigrant Jews and Italians and whatever else. They came from poor backgrounds, yet they looked at themselves differently than they looked at their black counterparts. And that's just the way American society was at that time. It's a horrific realization, and something that I know personally, like as a white person, I never really realized the full extent until I started reading all this black media. It's just something I wish that, somehow that every school in the United States had access to black media of that time period. And, the kids and college age people and whoever could just sit down and read it and say, like, you just read the black media time, read these newspapers, look at these headlines, and now you'll understand. It's not a abstract like it is to a lot of people when you discuss history and stuff like that. It's very real. It's very raw when you read newspapers that talk about the daily lynchings or the beatings. I mean, there are countless riots and fights and things like that would go on that weren't reported in the white media, but were constantly going on where a black person or a group of black kids would be beat up by white ones, and nobody even thought anything of it. It was just, it's a horrific part of American history.
Mm-hmm. And Ken, there's one more item on this list.
Yeah.
So I've also seen attributed to Mr. Barreaux the creation of the first superheroine.
Right.
So,
right. This came out of his studio. This came out of the Majestic studio, and it was for one of Harry Donenfeld's pulps, and it was called Olga Mesmer, the girl with the X-ray eyes, and she's a superhero. And this was 1937, a year before Superman. Okay, so she had superpowers, and she was appearing, but she appeared in a pulp magazine and not in a comic book. And even though it's not Barreaux drawings on this, there's a very good chance that Barreaux had a hand in the creation of this character. Like I said, he was a very, very talented guy, very smart guy in certain ways. He was just a racist and not a very good person.
Hey, Ken, one of the things that you mentioned, particularly in your book, was this one contribution he made to a book called New Fun.
Right.
And that was on a publication that would later become DC Comics.
Yep.
Can you tell us the significance of Adolphus's contribution to New Fun?
Well, just like I mentioned earlier, he was even though this wasn't done through Majestic Studio, it was done for this startup. It was created by Malcolm Wheeler Nicholson, and what's significant about it is this is literally the beginning of the American comic industry as we know it here in the United States today, and actually throughout the world, because it was the first artwork and stories created explicitly for comic books. Prior to this time, everything that was in American comic books were reprints, and they were reprints of comic strips. Prior to this time, comic books were basically giveaway items in premiums that were created as advertising for like soaps in gas stations and different companies like that. They would give away these magazines, which were collections of comic strips, and they called them comic books. But Wheeler Nicholson came up with this idea of publishing original material. And one of the artists that he chose was Adolphe Barreaux, and it's right there in the very first issue of the very first American comic book to contain original artwork. And he was essential to it. He was an important part of it.
It's interesting that you're able to make that find. How were you able to confirm that his contribution in New Fun would also be the first published work by a black artist in an American comic book? Because that's a really significant.
Oh yeah, I mean a lot of it's reverse engineering, Paul. It's finding out. First, the stories about Adolphe Barreaux possibly being black, and then me going back and confirming all that. As you can see, I went and did all these census records, and I went back literally to the slavery records that they had prior to the Civil War to try to find out more information about his family and stuff. And I traced each aspect of it, to connect everything, to fill in the blanks of Barreau's past. And when you do, you realize, you say, like, this man was undoubtedly, he was a black man, and he worked on this comic book. There's no doubt about it. I mean, he was right there at the very beginning. It couldn't possibly be any further back. That's it. He was there at ground zero, and that's hugely historical as far as not just black comic book history, but comic book history in general, and actually American popular culture history, because that's where the comic book started, and he was right there at the beginning.
So one thing that confused me a bit, and even as we've been going back and forth, kind of preparing for this show, it still confused me, is the different names he's used between Adolphe and Adolphus,
Right. Well,
Barreaux and Gripon. Could you
Okay.
tell us a little bit about that and maybe how it changed over time?
Okay. He was born Adolphus Barreaux Gripon. And even though he was a junior, even though they didn't put junior at the end of his name, because his father had the same name. That's the name he was born with. Then, when his aunt moved him and his sister up to New York, they changed their name. And he changed his name at that point, because he was 15. He changed his name to Adolphe Leslie Barreaux. And then when he was going to Yale, he wanted to make himself sound really exotic. He changed his name to Adolphe Leslie de la something or other Barreaux to try to make himself sound French. And he started telling everybody he was from New Jersey. Like I say, he totally made up himself. He created a totally different persona. And along the way as he did, he made up names and everything else. Everything about him was fake.
Okay. So I guess, all of this on balance, it just leaves me, I guess, conflicted, because he's responsible for so many firsts. I think some of the things he did helped to make the comic industry what it is today. Also probably created opportunities unwittingly for black artists as well. Yet, and
Right.
He disowned and hid his his heritage as well. So it just leaves me kind of like, yeah. You probably put more thought into this than anybody else. What are your thoughts when you look at this man on balance?
Well, you see, I feel the same way, obviously, because okay, this is complicated for me because there's other people I've admired in my life who I admired the work that they've done, but I may not care for them as a person. And that could be certain actors or musicians or whatever. And, every life is complicated. Everybody has, is complex. All of us. There's good and bad aspects. Barreaux was, he went out of his way to reject his blackness. And for that, he should be condemned, I believe, because he was so extreme about it. If he had just passed as white, but still embraced his blackness, in his personal life or something, it'd be much easier to take. But ironically, he never would have had the opportunity to do all these first if he hadn't passed as white. And see, that's what's weird about it. If he'd been black, none of those first would have happened.
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying? If he'd walked in as a black man, he probably well, he wouldn't have got the job with Harry Donenfeld. He may not have gotten the job working on Wheeler Nicholson's New Fun comics. You see what I'm saying? He
Yes.
probably never would have started his own studio. Yeah, he probably
that high school that he went to. Go on.
right.
Well,
Yeah,
high school. Yeah.
yeah, he went to DeWitt Clinton. He went to Yale. I mean, none of those things would have happened if he hadn't passed his way. You know, so like I say, you know, I'm very conflicted about him. On a personal level, you don't like the guy, but he's a fascinating character. And that's why, you know, like you say, he's the mirror image of Middleton, who, you know, they came from basically, you know, the same city, relatively close proximity to each other in time and everything, but they couldn't have gone through life more differently. You know, and it's they're both basically dealt the same cards, you know, but they decided to take a different path. J. Edgar Hoover. Well, it's like I say, he was a weird guy. And next time, if I get to talk about Elmer Stoner was also a very light-skinned black man, but he went through life as a black man. He never walked away from it. He never rejected it. And he fully embraced it. Yet his own sister passed as white, and she did so her entire life. So, you know, even within families, you know, it was a situation. It's a very complex issue, and it's like I say, there's an article, I believe you can find it on the internet still. I think it was in Forbes only like 2 weeks ago, where they talk about this, and they talk about different people, how, you know, they would a lot of times they would pass themselves off as Italian or Indian or something like that. You know, they had fairly dark skin, you know, and people would just accept it. But it was a way of dealing with the blatant racism of the time. And, you know, I get it. I get it. If you can do it, why not? You know, but he was just extreme in the way he went about it.
Yeah. So yeah, definitely. So I just want to once again thank you for joining us this evening.
Oh, sure.
Also for the time and effort you put into the research, the digging you've done to bring this to the world. And you know, I think we'd like to you know, definitely have a discussion with you about Elmer Stoner if you'd be willing to come back at some point.
I would love to talk about Elmer Stoner.
Yeah. Paul, Rich, anything else on your end?
No, we just greatly appreciate your scholarship and greatly appreciate you taking the time to make a really important work for comic books in general, but certainly for the Black comic collecting community.
Well, thank you. Like I say, it means a lot to me. Like I say, was a very personal book in a lot of ways. It was a journey for me, and you know, it's hard to even express that to people. But thank you, Paul.
Yes, sir. Just want to also close in saying thanks again for your time and your effort. I do want to say something about Barreaux real quick. This is actually, I won't say it's a personal testament. It's actually something that I think about this guy because of my mother. My mother's favorite movie is a 1934 movie called Imitation of Life.
Yep.
And that is, I remember watching that movie with my mother and watching my mother cry because, you know, of the circumstances that took place. And that was just a real thing. You know, for people at that time, it was just like, okay, life is a lot easier if you're white. And
yep.
if you, like you said, if you can do it, why not? But in that movie, we learned how painful it was and how, you know, a certain level of regret goes with that. And in terms of Barreaux, I think that he may have perhaps went the direction he went through to quote unquote make himself feel more authentic, if that makes any sense. Because that's pretty radical for him to like go all the way far right the way he did. And it's just an amazing story and that guy probably needs a story himself in the movie. So,
Well, that's why I combined him and Middleton, because, like I said, they were, the exact opposite, but linked in certain ways too. It was just two more fascinating stories that that I came across.
Absolutely. Well, thanks again for your time and your labor. This has been a blessing to us and our community.
Well, it's my pleasure. I want to thank you guys too. If I just have a second to do that, I mean, you're really giving me the time to talk about this book in depth, and each one of these guys. Most of the time when I've been interviewed, it's a very quick kind of thing and pretty superficial. And I appreciate the time that you're giving me to talk about this. I want to thank you guys.
Yeah, well,
thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we really want to make sure that we create opportunities. Oh, there's the store.
Yeah, tornado's coming. Better hurry up.
create learning opportunities to know where our industry has come from, where Black artists have come from, to get to today, and to make sure that as much as can we can shine a complete balanced light on history as well. So with that said, for anybody who didn't see the first interview, you can always catch that replay. The first interview was on the topic of Matt Baker, so check that out if you haven't seen it. Also, just a quick statement about the importance of making sure that if you have a comic series that you like, if there's a particular artist or writer that you like, the best way to support them is to buy their books before that final order cutoff. And the reason for that is because when you subscribe or when you add it to your pull list prior to that final order cutoff, that's the way to make sure that what your actual order turns into an order against that publisher. If you just buy it off the shelf, then there's not an incremental book that was ordered. But if you order before the final order cutoff, there's one incremental book. That's like your vote. So make sure you do that. That's our regular reminder on all of our shows. And also check out, if you're new to our channel, feel free to check out any of our recent specials. As you can see, we've interviewed a lot of creatives. Then Rich has his Sunday show, Real Talk with Rich. Paul has his Friday shows, Wakanda, Whiskey, and Blerdom. And then once every month or so, we have a ladies live as well, or the ladies of Black Comic Lords have a ladies live. So feel free, check out the whole channel. Also, give us a like, give the show a like. Be sure to subscribe so you know when the next one's coming up. And hopefully we'll be able to have Ken Quattro on for part 3 of our series. So with that said, this is Derek for Paul and Rich. Thank you very much. And Mr. Quattro, thank you as well.
Yep. Thank you.
Peace.
Thank you.
All right. Good night.